Your brain might just help you learn something in more ways than one. Welcome to Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology. Dr. Bell is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He'll be your guide on this crazy exploration designed to bring life back into our existence. Can you become the element of change in an ever-changing world? Possibly, but you've got to listen on to find out. Now here is the host of Absurd Psychology, Dr. Gary Bell.
Welcome, everybody. All right, today we're talking about living with numb, muted feelings. You know, in pop psychology, even in everyday conversation, people toss around phrases like, I just want to feel safe. Being numb helps me cope. But as research and clinical observation have indicated, emotional safety and emotional numbness are distinct psychological states. And confusing these two can slow your growth and isolate you from support and leave you stuck in patterns that feel safe but aren't. You know, many people don't realize it, but they are just walking through their life. They are numb. Their feelings are not available to them. They're doing all the things they're supposed to do. They're being with the kids, being with their spouse, being there, doing their job, going on vacations, interacting with people, watching comedies, going to comedy clubs. They're doing anything to try to stimulate themselves and look like they exist. But the truth is, they are often so traumatized by their existence or their previous history that they are just not available. They're not available, and everybody thinks they're available, and everybody doesn't understand why they're so muted. But the truth is that they have lost a lot of their will to live. They are just existing for others, walking through life, maybe drinking, maybe smoking, maybe drinking, maybe taking drugs. Whatever they do, they're just trying to escape this existence. And there are so many people that live like this. You know, before we dive into the signs of confusion, we have to define both the terms of, of the distinct numbness and the distinct need for safety as ingredients of this numb state of living, this muted state of life. Emotional safety is a state in which you feel secure expressing your whole range of feelings, and it's rooted in the belief that supportive connections, trust, acceptance are possible in every relationship you have and in the environments you live. Now, emotional numbness refers to a reduced capacity to feel emotions, and it's often coping to overwhelming stress, trauma, and internal conflict. And ironically, numbness can feel safe because it reduces your emotional pain. But that feeling of nothing matters isn't the same as genuine safety. It's more of a psychological shutdown to try to prevent anyone from hurting you, trying to build a wall around yourself. And there's a lot of work out there that highlights how emotional numbness shows up in clinical context. For example, often trauma-exposed people, particularly those with post-traumatic stress disorder, exhibit rapid swings between emotional states. Now, emotional numbing symptoms in particular are very known to intensify the pattern of reacting sharply to negative stimuli and then shutting down emotionally. So a lot of these people avoid conflict simply because they are numb. And while it feels as though numbing is helping them in the moment, it isn't difficult to see how it's balanced a state of safety and reality. It's not. It's created them just being there for their kids, for their spouse, for their customers, for their employers, and for anyone that needs them. They're just existing. And it's a survival adaptation that many people take on because many parts of their life have overwhelmed them and taken their will. And what is your will? Your will is the raw, basic person that if you're dropped in the middle of the jungle, you will figure out how to survive. Well, people that are numb are just kind of waiting to be killed. Yes, they're doing everything they can to protect themselves out of obligation, but the truth is they're waiting to die. And the truth is also that there are many people in this world that live a suicidal life. They don't really take care of themselves. They don't take care of a lot of things. They don't really give everything, all of themselves, because in reality, they don't want to live. But they don't want to find out when they're going to die either. So they just don't take care of themselves. And they kind of wind down and gently fade off into the horizon, eventually by natural causes. Sometimes they drink too much, sometimes they smoke, sometimes they eat like pigs, sometimes, whatever. You can usually tell a suicidal person by the way they take care of themselves. And I'm not saying overtly suicidal, I'm saying covertly, where they don't like themselves and they would rather be dead. But they don't, once again, they don't want to find out when they're going to die. Emotional safety is foundational for overall well being, especially in environments where reducing emotional distress without undermining emotional expression is a therapeutic goal. And it's also a goal of existence. And what you want to do is enable connection and self-regulation and emotion, not emotional detachment. So emotional connection and self-regulation is where life is. That means you're still vested. There's some key signs of what you're experiencing isn't emotional safety, but rather emotional numbness. The first sign is you prefer feeling no emotions over feeling uncomfortable. Emotional safety is a state of calm vulnerability where you can feel your emotions without fear of judgment or threat. It doesn't mean you're never uncomfortable, but you can tolerate discomfort with support without shutting down emotionally. Emotional numbness in other contrast is characterized by emotional blunting, or another a clinical term is called a flat affect. You might describe your experience as not feeling anything, good or bad. And that absence might feel like a hard won immunity from emotional hurt, but it's really a defense mechanism. And the truth is, anybody who loves you, your children, your spouse, your family, your friends, they know you're not fully available. They know you're just partially there. You think you're being nice and secretive and you're just faking it and everybody thinks it's okay and you're doing a great job. But underneath it all, subconsciously, without communicating it overtly to you, many of these people really understand they're only getting a percent of you, especially your children. Emotional numbing, especially in trauma and stress, shows that the numbness corresponds to reduced emotional reactivity, which isn't the same as regulated, safe emotional experience. It means that you're sitting in a very joyful situation and you're feeling no joy at all, but you're acting like you feel it. If you notice that in your behavior, you may need to ask yourself some questions. Do I notice subtle emotional shifts like joy, irritation, or sadness, or do I feel blank most of the time? And when something meaningful happens, do I feel it even a little, or do I shrug it off? If somebody important to me has passed away, do I really feel it, or am I just there? If I'm watching somebody in the hospital, and I'm supposed to be supporting them. Do I really care or am I just being there? If you picked that alternative, the latter, am I just there? You're probably confused. You know, you you also have indicators like this. You avoid or suppress emotions instead of integrating them. Emotional safety allows for the presence of all feelings, even difficult ones, without overwhelming panic, withdrawal, or self-attack. But a person who feels emotionally safe understands, even the nervous system level, that the safety is begotten by regulating your emotions and not erasing it. Some people would say that's having faith. On the other hand, emotional numbness shows up as avoidance, suppression, shut down. And you might notice that there are patterns to a numb person, changing the subject when emotions come up, feeling disconnected from your loved ones who you're supposed to love, using busyness or distraction to avoid feelings. These patterns are not a sign of mastery, they're methods of avoidance. And it's almost common knowledge now that avoidance and suppression are maladaptive coping responses, ones that maintain a lot of distress over time rather than true safety and regulations. And so people are very confused by their own emotional state between emotional numbness and emotional safety. Emotional safety being a more balanced emotional approach where you're plugged in. Also, emotional numbness can feel confusing and unsettling. You may notice that your inner world has gone quiet with no joy, no sadness, just a flat sense of nothing. Some people describe it as living on autopilot or watching life from a distance rather than truly being a part of it. While it may feel like something's wrong, emotional numbness is not a personal failure. It's often a protective response, and your mind is trying to cope with something that is too overwhelming, or many things that are too overwhelming for you to cope with. So let's nail down what emotional numbness is. It refers to a reduced ability to feel emotions. Instead of experiencing a range of feelings, everything may feel muted or absent. And in daily life, it can appear as feeling flat or empty most of the time, losing interest in things you used to enjoy, difficulty connecting with other people, feeling detached from your own body or surroundings, and knowing you should feel something, but you're actually not feeling it. These things are numbness. This means you are beyond your coping skills. And the common causes of this feeling are very, very prevalent. Potential causes, even, are very prevalent. One of them is blunt trauma, where you've been given some very, very bad news, whether it's about yourself or other people. But what happens is in these signs is you have to understand that trauma and PTSD cause emotional shutdown, and it prevents that overwhelmed feeling, but then it persists. And you might feel disconnected, avoid reminders, switch between intense emotions and feeling nothing. If you were in a war and you watched your best friends get killed, that might be beyond your coping skills. And so when you come back home, you may only be a shell of the person that you once were. If you've been raped, you may end up being a shell of the person you once were. Yes, you want to have all the normal things. You want to have a spouse and children and a life and a job and a home. You want to do all these things. But the problem is you're not available for them. The other thing that happens is depression. It's often experienced as emptiness or a flatness rather than sadness. You may lose interest in things, feel unmotivated, describe life as gray or meaningless. It's kind of like living like Eeyore. And then there's burnout and chronic stress. This causes that numbness. Prolonged demands gradually drain emotional capacity. You may feel exhausted, detached from work or other people, or struggle to feel engaged or present. And then there's grief, the loss of yourself. Numbness can appear as an early stage of processing loss. You may feel shock, disbelief, a sense of emotional blankness before any feelings emerge. And this happens quite often when the first time you have to grieve a major loss in your life. Medications, some antidepressants reduce emotional intensity. You might feel more stable, but also notice a dulling of both positive and negative emotions. And many medications can cause that if you're getting the wrong dose. If you actually feel numb because of medication, you need to go back to your doctor and change medications or get a different prescription of what dosage you're taking. Another thing that causes detachment is called disassociation of yourself or reality. You may feel like you're observing your life from the outside or that things around you feel unreal or distant. This happens when you feel numb. These are signs that you are living in a numb state of being. Then there's the thing called alexithymia, difficulty identifying, describing emotions. You may notice physical sensations like tension or a racing heart, but you don't know what the specific feelings are. That's once again called alexithymia. Alexithymia. Now, why did your brain shut down emotion? Its core, emotional numbness, is a survival mechanism. When your brain is exposed to overwhelming stress, trauma, prolonged pressure, it may reduce emotional intensity to protect you. And what that does is involve changes in the nervous system, including the release of natural pain dampening chemicals and reduce activity in emotional processing areas of your brain. Also, chronic stress also plays a role. Elevated cortisol levels can impair your brain's ability to regulate emotions, gradually reducing your capacity to feel. And over time, this can lead to a sense of disconnection, not because you don't care, because your system is overloaded. What helps you feel again? There's many things, and we need to go into some of that, and we're going to do that when we take a break. But what I want to talk about before we take a break is that you only the idea of indicating to yourself that you only feel emotionally safe when you're disconnected. This is an important symptom of emotional numbness, that people maintain their numbness because they believe that makes them feel safe. But what it does is it kills their ability to have intuition, to be able to read things around them. That dullness dulls all of their sensory perceptions, so they're actually more vulnerable by not feeling. Individuals who might be emotionally numbed can come to believe that they are emotionally safe because they don't register hurt at all. The truth is that when you are a kid who's been neglected, like many people in a European, Eastern European traditional culture, or a culture like Africa, or some other cultures like Asian cultures where people treat you like crap when you're a baby. And as you grow up, you don't have a lot of connection. What happens is numbness. And you go through life and you get married and you do all these things and you make a lot of money, but you don't feel it. And it's really sad for people to live in that state. And it can be fixed. All right, we're going to take a quick break and we're going to come right back and talk more about emotional numbness. So come back.
You are tuned in to Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology. If you have a question for Dr. Gary or his guest, please email drgbmft@sbcglobal.net. Or you can just click on Email Host on the Voice America page. Now, back to Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology.
Welcome back, everybody. All right. When we talk about this emotional numbness, many people feel like it's interpreted as numbness as protection. True emotional safety doesn't isolate you from experience. It's supposed to ground you from within. And while emotional numbness may feel like safety, precisely because it removes the emotional risk, the safety remains illusory. So in trauma psychology, emotional numbing is often seen as part of a survival response rather than an adaptive emotional state. And so, with trauma exposed people that report numbness as well as strong negative reactions, in other words, their symptoms and their systems oscillate between states of threat and shutdown. There's no balance in their emotional regulation. In contrast, emotional safety is a stable platform that enables you to have access to feelings without being overwhelmed by them. If you look at people that drift through life, let's say they had a very traumatic childhood, and through their life, their intellect is never fully realized, or even if their intellect is fully realized, it's realized as a coping skill rather than who they really are. They throw themselves into their intellect. But other people just drift through life. Oftentimes kids that are molested and raped in their childhood or neglected deeply or abused by their horrible breeding stock parents, they end up going through life with a very low self-esteem and feeling numb, feeling like I'm not supposed to feel a lot of things. Really not available. I married this beautiful person and I'm such a turd. Why can't I turn my feelings on? If you're curious to know your emotional stability is held up by numbness or safety, you have to ask yourself, do you feel safe only when you feel nothing? Can you experience a range and recovery both in highs and lows in a way that doesn't ruin you? Can you actually understand what it's like to exist and feel? If your calm comes from detachment, it may be a clear sign that you're relying on maladaptive coping mechanisms to escape your emotions. Often people that are numb, you're going to find them going to a movie and crying and not even understanding why they're crying because they're so numb they can't identify their own pain. We got to look at what helps us feel again. If you can at least acknowledge without judging yourself, recognizing that numbness is a protective response, it reduces self-criticism and it creates a space for healing. So instead of thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I feel anything? You might say, I've been under a lot of stress and it makes sense that my system is trying to protect me. That means that it's not there forever. And it doesn't have to be. If you can just make peace with the fact that currently you feel numb and you know that you want to feel something different, you're at the very beginning of healing. You also want to reconnect with your body. Simple practices like breathing exercises, stretching, grounding, even cardio can help, even lifting weights can help restore the link between physical sensations and emotions. Wouldn't hurt to take a couple minutes to pause, notice your body. You might be naming sensations. Are my shoulders tense? Is my breathing shallow? Or try to place your hand on your chest and take slow breaths, focusing only on the sensation of breathing. Emotional numbness, once again, is a coping mechanism where people shout out their feelings as a result of, shut out their feelings as a result of trauma, overwhelming stress, depression, or anxiety. And while that state offers temporary relief, it may hinder emotional connections and processing over time. So if you try to understand the causes and the symptoms, which we've been hitting on very early in this program, if we can come to the understanding, then we can begin to move through a healing process. But what does understanding emotional numbness require? Well, if you're not feeling and you're not expressing emotions very much, you're probably in that state. Emotional numbing is a mental and emotional process of shutting out feelings, and it may be experiences as a deficit of emotional responses or reactions. And it also may be looked at as something you need to seek help for. Feeling numb is often temporary. However, for some people, emotional numbness becomes a way to shield yourself from further emotional and physical pain. Although it may offer short-term relief, relying on the strategy can lead to long-lasting consequences. So why don't I care about anything? Well, there may be an inability to fully engage in your life. Maybe there's no examples of human beings that have engaged in life in your childhood. Maybe you grew up in a very Nordic culture where people are like icebergs and don't feel anything, or a Danish culture where people are just bland and plain and don't express emotion whatsoever. And when they have kids, they just breed and they throw them out to the wild and they eat dinner together and do a few things. But honestly, they don't really embellish deep emotion. Difficulty accessing your feelings. Well, it's hard to access feelings if you've never had the ability to do it. A sense of distance or detachment from other people, a feeling of flatness or physically, emotionally. How do people get to the state that we see where they completely don't care about violating other people's rights, other people's feelings? They just blow up, they kill people, they stab people. They, why do people do that? Why do we got all these psychotic liberal and progressives and these socialists and communists? Why do we have all this? It's because they are stupid, because they live in numbness. They don't have access to major feelings. They don't have access to their full self. They're traumatized, and they project all that trauma on Donald Trump because he's an easy target for all that, because inside them, they're just like him. But what we have to understand is that this numbness is a very real thing, and it can affect so many parts of our world, and it can affect how people make decisions for other people. And this thing, this emptiness, this detachment is very, very, very hurtful to the progress of our human race. Now, if you lived out in a cabin in the woods where people had very little manners and very little concern, and kids were meant to go work in the field, that was a pretty traumatic life. Third world countries are a pretty traumatic life. And so many of our ancestors lived through trauma. They lived through trauma. Many people actually embraced the idea of war because they could finally leave this planet. And that was a way out, honorably. Life is very difficult, but we have the possibility with technology, with our brains, with the way we have evolved. If we can get away from trauma and move more towards the human being that is emotionally attached and has access to emotions, we could find the middle as a civilization together if we had access to our feelings and felt safe enough with each other. But since we still try to be tribal creatures, that tribalness creates a lot of war, creates a lot of conflict, and creates a lot of trauma. If you feel flatness or physically and emotionally struggling to experience positive feelings like happiness, that means that you're numb. Losing interest in things that you used to love, you're numb. Preferring isolation over social interactions. Oh, I'm an introvert. No, you're probably numb. And you've convinced yourself that the reason you're an introvert is because you're numb. The deal is that we as human beings have to understand that life is a very complex thing. And we are very complex creatures. And we also need to understand that, there are challenges that we all go through in this life. And we have to embrace the idea that, there are challenges. And these challenges in our life are a part of our existence. And we can either take that as a positive or we could take that as a negative. But what we really, really need as people is to have great respect for the idea that we as people are, going through life, experiencing different things, and we have to respect each other for that. It's interesting and it's hard to understand that this life can be a struggle, and we have to embrace that as human beings. All right, there's other signs that you're numb. You start small with awareness, instead of and signs that you're numb of trying to heal. The starting small with awareness is a very important ingredient. Instead of expecting strong emotions, notice subtle signs of slight irritation, calmness, or interest, and start speaking about it. I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that. Not sure what I'm feeling. I'm feeling this, 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 this. This is an important thing for us to heal. You also want to reduce avoidance. You want to gently allow emotional experiences, even if they feel uncomfortable. Avoidance often maintains numbness over time. Instead of immediately distracting yourself, with your phone when discomfort arises, you might pause and sit with the feeling for a moment. I don't like this feeling, but I can stay with it for a few seconds. That's what you want to tell yourself. You want to find yourself safe in feeling emotions. That is a very important ingredient when you want to heal. You know, if you're going to isolate, and this is what COVID did to people, isolation. When you're sitting in isolation, that is going to warp your brain. We have the worst dialogues with ourselves. When we sit in silence, we fill in every blank we can with all kinds of catastrophic things. We create a lot of anxiety within ourselves by isolating. We are not meant to be isolatory creatures. We are tribal creatures. We need each other. We are built that way. You don't want to go against that because if you spend too much time alone with yourself, you're going to come to a lot of negative conclusions about life, about people you love, and you're going to warp those relationships into your own reality. That can be very, very, very destructive. You know, Safe connections are a huge part of healing. Emotional numbness tends to worsen in isolation. Safe, consistent interactions, even small ones, can help restore emotional engagement. Sending a simple message like, hey, just checking in, or having a short, low pressure conversation with someone you trust, even if you do not feel fully present, is a reminder that you need to be alive. It's critical to address the root cause of numbness. If numbness is linked to trauma, depression, medication, targeted support is very, very important. To be in a group of people where you can talk about your feelings, or even if it's a one-on-one situation with the therapist, that can be a very helpful place to move through your feelings. If emotional numbness persists for weeks or months and affects your relationships, accompanied by distress, it is important to seek professional help. A psychologist can help identify the underlying cause and guide you through appropriate interventions. But to rebuild connection, emotional numbness is not permanent. It is your mind's way of protecting you when something feels too much to process. So feeling again is not about losing control. It's about reconnecting with yourself, building resilience, rediscovering what it means to be fully present in your life. We've got to grab on to this life. You only have one life. But here's the deal. Your soul is your feelings. Your feelings are your motivators. And if your feelings are all based on fear and obligation, you're going to lose yourself. What you have to understand is that the meaning of life comes from emotions. So, for instance, one person may want to go on vacation and be lazy. The other person may want to go on vacation and see a bunch of things and go get stimulated by the environment. So that means that emotions for two different people are very different. What connects us as human beings is the vulnerability to be able to identify those feelings, make them important to you. Your feelings are important to me. My feelings are important to you. And by doing that, we're making room for each other's soul. And that is where we get deep connection. It is not in the things you do together where you get deep connection. It is not participating in your kid's life and going to their games and sitting there on your phone the whole time that is going to give you deep connection. What is going to give you deep connection is actually being there and participating. and feeling and caring about other people's feelings. Because when you care about other people's feelings, you start to have to access your own feelings. Life is a feeling based proposition. In the end, the weight and how you measure things and how important things are to you is going to come from the emotional attachment you have. When you are numb, you have no emotional attachment. And don't mistake it for apathy, because if you get to apathy, apathy means you're empty. Apathy means I just don't care anymore. Now, apathy happens like a slippery slope. It takes a long time. Numbness can take a very long time. It could be a slow burn, and it can also be a blunt trauma. Excuse me. But what's important to understand is where your numbness comes from is how you can connect and heal. You have got to cognitively go back and break down what is causing my numbness and re-describe what the problem is and what the event was that caused it, and decide at this point in your life what power you want to give that problem. You know, if you're going to define yourself as a rape victim your whole life, you're probably going to be a very detached person. You're probably going to have problems having intimacy. You're probably going to have problems connecting with certain people. That's never a good thing. You need to go back to the core of what drives loneliness to be able to deal with loneliness. You've got to reconstruct what is causing loneliness, break it down, and then reintegrate it into yourself. Now, numbness actually may come from the idea that you go through something like lose your job and you come home and let's say nobody is supportive of you. Nobody seems to care. Nobody gives you encouragement. And if that happens, you may decide, I don't need these people. I'm not going to attach very closely to my kids. I'm not going to attach very closely to my spouse because they haven't supported me in the way I need it. So I'm just going to detach from them. And I'm going to call it my problem. And I'm going to go deal with it. Well, if you do things that way, you're going to lose your feelings for your kids and for your spouse. That's never a good thing. What you have to understand is if you're not communicating your feelings, people are probably having a hard time identifying with you and a hard time understanding how to give you what you need. You know, we emotionally balanced, emotionally safe people are able to communicate what we need. That is an important thing in this life. That is how we get self-respect. And what you need is emotional. It's not logical. All right, we're going to take another break and we're going to come right back.
You are tuned in to Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology. If you have a question for Dr. Gary or his guest, please email drgbmft@sbcglobal.net. Or you can just click on Email Host on the Voice America page. Now, back to Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology.
Welcome back, everybody. All right, we were talking about emotional numbness, and some people just live in this state of being. You know, people with emotional numbness might use strategies to resist confronting their emotions. Even if they're doing it unconsciously, they might use avoidant behaviors and steer clear of certain people or situations, conflict avoidant. They might be in denial, which is a common defense mechanism people use to avoid emotional triggers and negative feelings. You know, emotional avoidance and PTSD, let's say, has a lot of causes. Feeling emotionally numb can happen as a result of physical or emotional pain. And in an attempt to protect yourself from being hurt again, it's not uncommon to disconnect, detach, or numb out feelings related to the situation. And when this happens, you might feel temporary relief that allows you to move on. But over time, this protective shield can begin to get in the way of connecting with other people and getting in touch with feelings that are both positive and negative. And there's a variety of reasons that you might feel numb. One of them is anxiety. People diagnosed with anxiety disorders may experience emotional numbness as a response to extremely high stress levels, fear, excessive worry. People that live in their head and catastrophize are creating enough trauma in their brain to feel numb, probably more than just a traumatic situation. If you're going to sit there and worry about everything in your life and live in fear, you're not going to survive very well. Your body's going to be on high alert all the time. Your heart's going to have to work 10 times harder. You're going to have a hard time staying in shape. You're going to have a hard time living because living in fear is not what we're designed to do. We need to live in faith. So what is faith? Well, when faith enters, fear leaves. When fear enters, faith leaves. So the deal is, if you live in faith, you live in the faith that things will get resolved. You live in faith that you know and have the tools to deal with whatever it takes to come. You may not have all the answers. You may not do it the right way. You may not do it the best way. But in the end, you made it this far and you will probably deal with just about anything in your life. So sitting around anticipating the worst possible things is never going to help you. We traumatize ourselves through catastrophization. If you learn more about living in faith, and I'm not talking about just God, not that that hurts, but the bottom line is living in faith is the way we are built. That is what we do, and that is what people that are emotionally available choose to do in their life. It is not foolish to live in faith. It is resilient to live in faith. That is what it takes. If you're going to calculate every possible negative outcome, you're never going to evolve and grow. You're just going to self-protect. But a lot of people live in that protective mode, and that disconnects them from their feelings. When this happens, temporary relief allows you to move on, but you move on numb. And over time, the protective shield can begin to get in the way of connecting with other people and getting in touch with your feelings. Now you're going to be isolating. Now you're going to be only giving a certain parts of yourself. Now you're going to be renegotiating what trust looks like in this life. If you're one of these people that is always making trust an issue, you need to shut the hell up and understand something. When you want to get to trust, you go on the pathway of and the bridge of I have faith. I have faith in you. I have faith that you learn from this. I have faith that we will get through this. I have faith that this problem will get resolved if I stay with it. That is what we owe this life. Persistency. You have to have faith to get to trust. Faith is the bridge to trust. Many people want to get to the destination of trust. You're probably not going to get there if you've been traumatized. You're probably not going to get there in the human race where people are both good and evil, where people are selfish, where people are weird, where people have mental disorders, where people are warped, and then we walk this planet and have to deal with politicians that are progressive and liberal. That's traumatic enough just to have to watch that shit every day of your life. But the deal is, living in faith means that you understand that you have to be buoyant. You have to ride the tide. You have to go with the waves and learn to go with it instead of go against them. This is what life is. And people that live that way have a much better way of coping with life than numbing your feelings. Alexithymia, which we mentioned earlier, might be the reason that it's hard to label your emotions. Some people have what's called borderline personality disorder. People with BPD may experience periods of emotional detachment or numbness, and it may feel as though their feelings are not their own. And so what they do is they try to grab onto the feelings of other people. And that's why they're called a borderline, because they flip-flop. They don't take on issues. They try to fit in with other people. And then what one person may agree with may be different than the other. So they line up with one person and then they'll line up with another person. And those people may be in conflict and they flip-flop between them both. And that's why it's called a borderline personality. These people have a lot of emotional numbness and detachment because they have likely been neglected or abused or both in their childhood. Then there's grief. When coping with death, a person may go through a period where they feel completely disconnected from their emotions. Usually that's in the very first phase of grieving. It's called denial. It's when they're planning the funeral and they're doing all the things that they're supposed to be doing, and they're just tra-la-laing their way through it. And everybody's going, wow, you're so strong. How'd you do that? Well, that's because they're in the denial phase of grieving. Then they go into what's called the bargain. Then they go into the bargaining phase, and then they go into the depression phase, and then they go into the angry phase, and then they go into the acceptance phase. And sometimes they do all that in 1 minute. And by the way, grieving can take up to 3 to 4 years, especially the first major grief. Depression. You know, going through depression episodes may be less attuned to your feelings, experiencing a dulling of emotions. So, what is depression? Depression is unmet expectations. That means that I expect you to show up on time. I expect my kid to get their homework done. I expect, my spouse to have done a certain thing. I expect for you to always follow through with the things you promise. If you're going to live in expectations, you're going to be a very depressed human being. Expectations are people who are very judgmental. And if you're going to live that way, you are a depressed human being, and you probably have a lot of numb feelings from having your expectations not met. Oftentimes, it's just not good. It's not good to live like that, but many people do. So if you want to get out of depression, and you want to be buoyant, and you want to have feelings, what you have to do is you've got to decide to have preferences. I prefer you talk to me like this. I prefer that you followed through. I prefer that you did your homework. I'd prefer that these things happen the way I wanted them to, but they didn't. So now we don't have failure and we don't have betrayal involved in our feelings. That's where preferences come from. That's a very healthy way to look at life. But people that are depressed, they have high levels of depression and mood dysregulation because they want to control everything. And depression is their way of controlling everything. Some people will lay on their ass in bed for days, numb to their feelings because they have expectations that are not being met, and they can't even they're so overwhelmed by it they just lay on their ass. They're already dead, but they're alive, but they're dead. They choose to be dead. Many people live as if they are dead, and it's really sad because your emotions are available if you choose to step back into your life. Then there's emotional dysregulation. Numbness can be a part of emotional dysregulation. It's often referred to as a form of disassociation, depersonalization, derealization, which can occur with stress, schizophrenia, PTSD, borderline personality, and other conditions. People who disassociate don't feel anything. They feel what they want to feel. They feel the emotions that are safe to them. So many people that are numb oftentimes rely on the most primitive emotions. And what is the most primitive emotions? Anger, rage, and irritability. Those are our most easily accessible emotions. And so people that hover around numbness are often irritable, angry, and enraged. And sometimes they keep it all inside themselves to avoid conflict. But then it comes out like a teapot that's boiling. It just blows, and it blows over stupid stuff, but that's what happens because they repress. Some medications make you numb, and it can be a side effect, and taking antidepressant can make you feel emotionally numb sometimes. It's probably the wrong dosage or the wrong medication, but it's essential to work closely with a doctor to choose the right medication. But boy, it is a roll of the dice sometimes to find the one that's going to work. Mental and emotional abuse is something that also causes numbness. Studies show that people who are emotionally abused as children are more likely to experience emotional dysregulation, including emotional numbing as adults. And if you're married to some abusive asshole, like many people are, some person that's judgmental, some person that is non-cooperative. Let's say you are in your second marriage with children from a previous marriage, and you've got this asshole that you're married to that doesn't like your kids. That's a pretty emotionally numbing state, and that person that you're with is a total turd. But the problem is you're married to them, you're stuck with them, and your kid's going to be tortured by them until you decide to either leave them or until they reach their adult life. All of this happens all the time. It happens all over, everywhere. And it's sad. And by the time your kids grow up, the truth is they're pretty abused in many ways. And they may say, I had the perfect childhood. That's bullshit. They've gone through a lot. Don't discount a kid's life because they say I had a perfect childhood. Maybe you had both parents in your life, but there's moments in your childhood where you were very vulnerable and very hurt. We all have that. We all have that. And we all need to recognize that our childhood comes with a lot of problems, some more than others. And if you like the ass and the tits, or if you like some guy's penis or whatever, and you look past all their trauma and their childhood and then you marry it, well, it's going to come later, but you're going to experience hell on earth because you like that organ. It's really sad, but some people are so stupid that they will marry based on that. Overwhelming stress causes numbness. Emotional numbness results from high levels of stress. So if you're feeling burned out emotionally or physically exhausted or you're overwhelmed, you might feel detached from your feelings. Physical abuse. People who are physically abused may feel emotionally numb. Feeling numb can be a coping mechanism to avoid dealing with dangerous or frightening situation. If you're going to grow up in a community that's a violent community, there's a good chance you're going to have emotional numbness just to deal with that. Because then you got to go to the grocery store. You got to be around them. You got to listen to your neighbors. You got to deal with the drug addicts. You got to deal with the homeless people. If you live in Seattle, that's all you see is homeless, deregulated people with crazy ass progressive people as politicians running our police department and wanting us all dead, but to pay our taxes, of course. Treatment for emotional numbness. There's a variety of treatment. Once a therapist or a psychologist may work for you in that department, but many people don't like to go to mental health. They don't want to deal with it. So the primary goal of psychotherapy is to stimulate an understanding of the problem, expose ourselves to the problem, and then problem solve. It's pretty cool because what it does is it objectively gives your brain a chance to come back at a problem that you may not have understood as a problem. But it's really important to understand that if you're emotionally numb, you need to get help now. And that is a very important thing. And if you can't do it for yourself, do it for everybody in your life that has to interact with you. You also want to develop a support system. If you're going to reach out to others, seek emotional support. Seek people that you feel understand what you are going through. You want to also stay physically active because you want to keep your body in good shape so that when you get your brain right, you'll be able to live and in tune. You also want to get adequate rest. Many people who don't sleep because they sit in their heads and worry and do all that catastrophization, people that don't sleep are like zombies. They're out of balance. If you don't sleep, if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to have a problem because your brain needs sleep to function. The other thing is to minimize stress by looking at, I have faith, I have dealt with this before, we will deal with this before, it's going to be okay. You've got to give yourself reassurance in this life. It's very, very important to get through this, but you got to set goals to heal. You got to be compassionate with yourself. You have to seek help. And you have to also confront your own suicidality as far as the way you live your life. All right, that's our show. I want to thank everybody for listening. I love hearing from you. You could do that on our webpage, voiceamerica.com, or voiceamericamedia.com, and libsyn.com, Libsyn, Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology. Now remember, you can't numb stupid, but every once in a while you can hit it with a 2x4. You got to remember also that you can have a heart and feel nothing. Also, feeling nothing, you drown in everything.